Hello, welcome to Microsoft Certified Professional Developer 4.0 with ASP.NET and C#. The content exam focus is 70-515, and the content is owned and created by Ravi Ganuri, Microsoft MVP.NET Videos.net. So video number 16, we're going to talk about one of the exam fundamentals, LINQ or Language Integrated Query. This was introduced in .NET 3.5. And it's to provide a rich way to query data. So .NET's been good at working with object-oriented development, but not so good as far as the language side with querying data. SQL is much more built to handle this type of data manipulation. And LINQ kind of bridges the gap, provides a way in .NET to work with data. And as we'll see, you can work with data that come from different data sources, whether it's SQL Server or just plain old objects, etc. So it's a much more efficient. You'll notice that if you can build your data access components with LINQ, you'll end up with a lot less code as you're working with data and collections of data. It's just a much more efficient approach and abstracts away some of the details here. So the various flavors of LINQ, there's LINQ to objects. We'll look at this in this video. This is just you can think of as we got some data, some in-memory objects, and how to work with those. We'll examine that. LINQ to XML, you might also hear called XLINQ. And then we'll also look at, in this video, LINQ to SQL, a very popular, where it uses actually an OR mapper. And we'll work with the data context object and show how that works. As well as LINQ to entities, the ADO.NET entity framework, which is not part of this video series. I'm going to go ahead and jump into my video and quickly get to a demonstration here. I'm simply going to demonstrate some LINQ to objects. And when you use LINQ to objects, when you use LINQ to SQL and all this stuff, you can start to begin to use the same syntax. So whether you're using LINQ to SQL, LINQ to XML, there'll be nuances and differences, but the basic concepts are going to be similar. Notice in my particular code here, I've just got some basic LINQ syntax, and then down here I've simply got a generic list we created with holding some videos, where I have just an author, a length, and a title. So I'm taking advantage of generics here at this point. See another video series we have on .NET for more information around generics. You notice here I'm just going to add a new class so you can see that this is actually happening for real in real time. I'm just going to give this a new author named Becky, and we'll just change the title up here to Demo LINQ. So I just have a collection here at this point, nothing fancy. But what is interesting is if I was to go to actually work with this data, I'll fix up and put my semicolon there, or the comma there. When I'm going to work with this data with traditional methods, maybe I used a loop. Let's say I wanted just to bind this to a grid view. It would take a fair amount of code. And if I wanted to do anything fancy with it all, like search, it would take quite a bit of code. Notice I'm using the var keyword here, implicit types, and I'm just basically making a call out to get videos, and I'm storing it into my videos keyword there. And then I begin to use this LINQ query. This is where it starts to get interesting. So again, I'm using an implicit type in C# with var query. And by using this LINQ syntax, you'll notice it's SQL-like. It seems a little backwards, maybe 180 degrees from SQL Server. Notice I've got my select statement at the very end, but it's just from V in videos. I'm just using a random name there named V. And I've got some IntelliSense at that point with my select statement, so I can select the title, the length, the author, or all the contents of V. And as we'll see, there's very straightforward. I can simply grab that and then use that as the data source for the grid view, and then go ahead and call data bind. What's interesting here is even though the LINQ code is up here, the actual execution will get delayed or deferred until I call data bind. So that's one of the properties or the nuances of LINQ. Be aware of that. So it doesn't matter really where the code's at. It's when I'm actually calling data bind is when we're actually executing that LINQ code. We'll look at the SQL that it generates in a bit. But right now I'll go ahead and I'll just start my web application, and we just expect to see there it is, my authors for the videos, how long they're running. Just basically had queried some data that was in an object, stuffed it into that query variable there, and then used that for my data source. So again, this starts to get interesting when I want to do things, like order by clauses and stuff that you might have done in SQL Server or T-SQL. Notice that I can just do an order by. I get the benefits of the IntelliSense again. Order by author, and then ascending or descending. I'll just make this descending. And again, as you start to build these queries out or work with this data in this way, that's very easy to do with SQL or T-SQL. You can do now in .NET in a very straightforward way. Notice my authors are now starting, going from Rob all the way up to the other author. I'll change this to ascending real quick just to demonstrate this is actually running and working. So moving data around like this or working with data like this becomes more difficult and kind of cumbersome in just plain old C#. But when we introduce link into the which is an extension on top of C# here, it becomes a very nifty experience. So, and again, this code up here is not actually executing until data bind is being called. So that's called delayed or deferred execution. It actually executes down here. So despite where the code is actually sitting once again. So, link can provide you rich benefits with working with the data in this way. Tremendously less, much less code here involved than if I was to do this stuff with like for each loops. I can introduce where clauses in here just like I would with my traditional set languages. I could just put where v.author equals Ravi here, and we'll go ahead and just run this. And this is just basically looking like T-SQL if you're already a SQL Server developer. So it's very natural. Notice that when I go ahead and run this, we should just end up with a one piece of data back. And again, this is linked to objects. So whether we're using link to XML, link to objects, link to SQL, there are differences and nuances. Some of this syntax, though, is going to apply to all. And you should have some familiarity with working with link for the exam 70-515. So notice I'm going to add a new class here. This is actually going to be a data type class over here underneath the C#, and it's going to be a link to SQL class specifically, which is going to give us the ability to use the OR mapper and this DBML extension at the end of this. We could use this link to SQL, which is a very popular approach to take data out of a SQL server and represent that inside of as a .NET object, and then work with that .NET object, similar to what we just did with the syntax with working with linked to objects. So if I just have a data connection over here in Server Explorer, this becomes a very easy, nifty drag and drop type experience. I can simply come in here, tie into a database, let's say the AdventureWorks database, for lack of a better example. Go ahead and click OK. And then you can spin down in here into the views and tables, and go ahead and we'll grab the employee table. Just drag and drop the table onto the design surface, and it's going to take care of wiring up the plumbing for us, creating a data context class, which we'll show how you use in a minute, through what's called pluralization or pluralization. This employees table turned into an employee, trying to more mimic what we call the classes in .NET. Notice here if I go ahead and right click, I'm going to go ahead and just add a new item. I'll add a new web page in here to keep this clean. I'll call this link to SQL and fast forward a bit. Where I can basically just wire up similarly a grid view and use this representation of that employees data table that actually lives in SQL Server. So the data context object, which we need here, is just the name of whatever that DBML file was with the data context appended to the back. So we called that data classes when we set this up. So this word data classes here, and then just append the word data context. That was created for you automatically. And I'm just going to paste in some simple link here, and once again I'm just grabbing some data, stuffing it into that variable query, again using implicit typing there in C#, and I can just select the data, work with the data in memory here, so to speak, just like it was with the link to objects. So all the same rich benefits of being able to easily traverse and work and query this data. I get all those benefits, all the benefits of the IntelliSense, the delayed execution. I can simply bind this to the grid view. We should see now the actual employees table coming back from SQL Server. So I'm very rapidly now building a data-driven application with language integrated query or link. And there are ways to modify properties and actually do updates, inserts, tie to stored procedures, all of that. Beyond what we're going to show in this particular video, please check back for supplemental videos and videos around links specifically for that. But if you notice, I'm going to actually show a little trick here. I'm going to go ahead and write the SQL out. So I'm just going to do a system.diagnostics.debug.writeline. I'll writeline that query, and that will spin that query out to the output window when we run this in debug mode, which I'll go ahead and do. And you can kind of examine the SQL statement. One of the interesting things about Link, it's very good at optimizing the SQL statements for you. So if you begin to write some fancier statements where you're using some, the where clause and you're grouping the data, etc., you'll notice this is very optimized out. It's just writing out the SQL. So you can examine the actual SQL that gets generated. This is useful if you're doing some type of troubleshooting or trying to figure out exactly what's going on behind the scenes with the query that's being built by Link. So that's just a common trick there. You can just write it out to the output window. So if you look at a little more details, I look at this object over here, my employee object. I look at the properties. You'll notice that if you come into the properties here, you have this idea of use runtime for the delete, the insert, and the update. That's by default. You could certainly change this. It's beyond what we're showing in this video, but there are ways to tie this in to use this object to go ahead and insert, update, or remove data from the actual data source, which would technically in this case B-SQL Server. If I look here further into the data class's data context object, it's just got a connection string here. All this plumbing handled for me. That's one of the great benefits at Link to SQL. It's very easy to use. If I was to actually take tables that had relationships, like foreign keys, for example, and I would drag and drop those onto the surface, Links definitely understands that relationship. You see the dotted line getting drawn here. It preserves that relationship, so we can leverage that, very easy to use, etc. So I can look at the properties of that as well and see the relationship that was built there. So I encourage you to examine Link more on your own, get using that, and go from there.